G'day friends and fans, welcome to Dave Talks Off Ukraine War Update for the 3rd of September 2025. Now the war continues and there's more words that have no meaning to the people who speak them. I, of course, am referring to the media, where the media seems to report on Ukraine with such glowing terms and such favoritism that many commentators would agree with me and say, if you just went off The Guardian, you'd think Ukraine was marching into Moscow. That there is so much that the Western media, it's fragmented. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. If you went only one source, you get this weird, distorted view of the war. But most of the media isn't even reporting it anymore. And you're getting more and more of the, what we call the sideline media. You have the legacy media, the named brands like The Guardian and the BBC, ABC, the Economic Times. You get weird reporting, but you get sectionalized reporting. Like the New York Times will put it in its section, mostly behind the paywall in world news, in its own little category. Now and again, the Post will bring it up in world news under its own little subcategory as well. But most of it is just blah, okay? Zelensky, however, every day has for the last month has been bleating about security guarantees. And since Trump's meeting with Putin, Zelensky has insisted that there will be no meeting until he gets the security guarantees in writing. But does The Guardian report this? Does anybody report this? Does anybody seem to pay attention to the facts? No, bro. The Guardian, Al Jazeera, even Sky News. Now, we know, right, that Xi and Putin and Modi are all working together. Kim Il-jung. BRICS is uniting behind Russia. Europe is fragmenting and going broke. Keir Starmer is jailing kids for flying. Keir Starmer has been accused of jailing kids for flying the British flag. Now, I think it's a bit more complicated than that. There was a protest. The protesters were herded by police and questioned. I actually think that nobody has technically been detained. It isn't actually the same as jailing kids. But a bunch of school kids were herded by police on TV before the BBC cut away to the commentary about far-right agitators spoiling what would have otherwise been a peaceful protest, not actually, actually trying to avoid the fact that the instigators of the violence were the police, yet again, by trying to trample the citizens. So, I can understand why a lot of people aren't interested in the Ukraine war. But so many, thousands, tens of thousands, are flocking to a single news source that has so many people thinking that Ukraine is smashing the Russian army. I'm not saying Russia isn't losing a tank or some men or even a truck. The Russian losses, however, are pale in comparison to Ukraine's losses. And the pro-Ukrainian sources never put out anything on Ukraine's losses, which have now estimated at 1.7 million, 700,000 of that in the first 7 months of this year. That Russia's taken more territory this year in the first 6 months of this year than all of last year. Some of that is retaking lost territory, so the maps are slow to update. But I bring you the maps as best as I can. Now, on the diplomatic side, Vladimir Putin has put out a statement that said the United States was listening to Russia's justifications for the invasion and that Moscow and Washington have a mutual understanding. I think they do understand each other, but President Trump, however, doesn't mean he approves, and Vladimir Putin never said Trump approved, but The Guardian and many other left-wing rags are acting as if Trump is the devil incarnate, pretty much urging Putin on, when that's not the case. There has not been a tougher president. What sanctions did Biden put on? Wait, those were all Trump sanctions. He never did anything else. Trump has expressed his disappointment. Has he increased the sanctions? No. Why? Because it's not Putin who's dragging his feet. It's Zelensky who's dragging his feet. Zelensky was supposed to meet with J.D. Vance. Zelensky was supposed to have a security conference with Europe. He's put that off until next week. Sorry, that was last week. It's this week, and he still hasn't met with the Europeans. His statement was repeated yesterday. That will be next week. And people had never caught on that the Kiev Independent is merely repeating the same story as last week. But the Kiev Independent is not independent. It's a rag that routinely takes down articles, edits articles, and routinely toes the party line. That Zelensky is always right. Now, the only voice of Europe that we have some information flowing through is Slovakia. And Slovakia's Prime Minister is in China for talks. Now, I don't trust Russia or China, but for trade to go ahead, right, you have to do something. You can't just pretend they don't exist. You have no power or influence over them without trade. China is in trouble. And I think China's woes are going to impact Russia's ability this year and next to wage war. And will probably cut. Now, if it wasn't for India, who is one of the most greediest, two-faced rats on this planet, okay, whose trade deals always suddenly miraculously end up one-sided in favour of India, and India end up dumping hundreds of thousands of their people onto other countries, to the point now where, look at Canada. Look at their attempts. Look at India's attempts to dump truck drivers on the United States, and everybody's saying, "Oh, but we need truck drivers." But this is the problem, right? Everybody's taking the easy way out, right? They don't. This globalization is favouring the overpopulated countries, and creating population decline in those countries who are basically the receiving end of migration. The left is purposely creating this chaos. in order to now, I shouldn't say trust me, but I am pretty sure that China and India are screwing over Russia. I think they held back Russia and never supported them in the United Nations since 2014. And only in even in 2022, when Russia went to the Security Council, nothing of significance. And then behind the scenes, China and India pushed Russia to invade when Ukraine shelled Donetsk. And the murdered politician, as a reminder, who was murdered a few days ago in Ukraine, was the man responsible for the shelling of Donetsk, which sparked the Russian invasion when Zelensky was promising peace and then did nothing about the private militias and the shelling of Donetsk, then denied the shelling of Donetsk, then dared the Russians to invade, saying that you're too weak, you'll never do it. And again, we have Boris Johnson, who clarified his statement, saying that he wasn't going to take a position. But said, whatever Zelensky said to Zelensky's face, whatever you decide, we will back. And Zelensky's advisor took that as permission, basically, to ignore Russia and continue with their so-called special military operation in Donetsk to deal with the so-called security threats, which was what Russia was talking about. So, we have Russian gas, thanks to coming through the Turk Stream, which, again, behind the scenes, attacks on Russian energy are all directed to weaken, right, Zelensky's neighbours, so that Ukraine can pressure them into supporting Ukraine. Claiming that he's Captain Sky Shield. I'm never going to let that one go. Again, was it yesterday or the day before, where Zelensky repeated the statement that he will be Europe's Sky Shield. And that he wants to host, he wants more aircraft, he wants F-35s. Like Ukraine, Ukraine isn't even worth one F-35, right? You sold everything, you sold Ukraine tomorrow on the open market. After debts are cleared, you wouldn't have enough to buy an F-35. That's how broke Ukraine is, okay? Potentially, Ukraine may be worth a few trillion. But remember, the cost of development, reconstruction, it ain't worth it. And before you say, oh, Putin's after the resources, that is a bit hard to point out when Russia has more resources already than Europe. Europe is the one who's after Ukraine's resources. And Russia and Ukraine did have deals, which Zelensky and others broke. They have no intention. Merkel has stated that they had no intention of honouring any deal with Russia. They didn't honour their agreement in the 90s to expand NATO. That was not just Boris Yeltsin, that also was Gorbachev, who both failed to get that treaty into. And we also know that one of the obstacles to stopping the expansion of NATO was how eager countries such as Poland were to join NATO, particularly at the time when US money, particularly US aid, joining NATO meant that Poland would get a boost to its defence budget, without lifting a cent, and that they would have millions of dollars in rental income per month on various sites. Now, a lot of that has not come to pass. NATO's expansion in Poland and Hungary and that, and other former Soviet bloc countries, has not been the cash cow, as you saw with the break-up of Yugoslavia, the war in Serbia, the cost of hosting and holding all these NATO parades, trying to fix their armament. Most Eastern European countries are still in Soviet-era armaments. Most of them, I think, T-56 and T-72s. A lot of them, however, have started. These are locally made. They're not old tanks. They're just not modern designs. Most of them, however, are fourth generation tanks, which is like 90s technology. And you're going to say, oh, so Ukraine is so powerful they could hold back the Russian army with 90s technology. Well, don't forget, the bulk of the Russian army is also 90s technology. The bulk of Ukraine and Russia are fighting each other out with outdated technology. Sure, they have some American M777s, some French Caesars, but the bulk of their forces are basically 1950s trucks with 1960s rocket launchers with rockets made in the 90s, 122mm. I don't even think Russia has deployed any of its higher missiles other than the Oryk a few times and some Kinzhals. I think the majority of the technologies being used in this war are all from the 90s. I think Russia has deliberately withheld, and as Russia says, as they see it as being in a proxy war with NATO. And nobody's come up with a decent argument against that. In fact, most haven't even denied that. But NATO can't make up its mind what its goal is and when they want to send troops. Keir Starmer, of course, is super eager to send troops. Again, this is all to create a killing field. All right? Ukraine was once the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. It, however, has squandered and developed, particularly in the 90s, a toxic relationship with Russia, which, of course, you can predominantly blame communism, but you can't blame everything on communism. Because remember, Ukraine has never accepted responsibility for any of its actions. And most of the toxic relationship has been Ukraine pretty much being a borrower and a beggar, but never a friend. Or never a good citizen of the Soviet. They didn't pay their bills properly or timely or on time. They weren't a net contributor to the collective whole. And they saw themselves as having their own the Soviet satellite. That they were above the others. So they had a toxic relationship with not just Russia, but the rest of Eastern Europe. But if you look at Ukraine's history, it has always been. Because remember, Ukraine was a grass wasteland at one point with only a few castles. They were the outpost of Russia, who was pushed west by the Mongols, and the Slavs pushed east by the Romans. And of course, then you had the Poles and the Czechs and the Romanians. Ukraine is a Russian Slavic nation that is speaking a language that is derived from Russian and predominantly built since the 17th century by Russia in some form or another. But instead of accepting its history, it wants to rewrite history. And to do so, they're creating a war and the conditions of war and the conditions of hatred for the Russian people to justify their actions. And you'll get the situation like in Yugoslavia or Serbia, or I should say more likely Serbia, where or Croatia, where you have, for a while Latvia and others, where those who remember the past will clash with those who want to create the future. Because the people who want to create the future have no idea that if you rewrite the past, you are not just doomed to repeat history, you intend to repeat history. And that is, Ukraine didn't just have the revolutions of the 1880s, but they also had the Russia. They were also part of the Russian Revolution, and had their own subsequent Soviet revolutions and battles in World War One, in World War Two, and post World War Two. They had battles in Ukraine up until 1956. They had many clashes because, again, what the Ukrainians are doing to the Russians is merely what they consider historical justice, that they're paying back the Russians for centuries, decades of oppression. But all you're doing is recreating what the Russians, you're punishing people today to basically absolve yourself of your own crimes, right? You can't punish past crimes. You punish somebody today for these so-called past crimes, you're only creating an enemy who will no longer respect you. And the fact that Putin has actually said that he wants a neutral Ukraine on his border seems to be a radical problem with Europe. So we'll get to the fact that some of these, that there's, again, a lot of air and missile strikes midweek. That's common. Russia has hit multiple targets across Ukraine today and most likely tomorrow as well. That they have continued fighting despite no advances, which is weird. They should have. But the buffer zone, they've shown no signs of actually putting any material effort into increasing most of their buffer zones. But today, again, Russian forces entered Kupiansk. And as I speak, as I record, there is still fighting going on in Kupiansk. So the Ukrainians, by pushing the Russian forces out, only opened themselves up to being attacked from the flank, which I think, if I remember rightly, I told you how the Russians were going for a three-pronged attack, the Trident attack, which America used against the Germans in World War II. The Americans, you would have a spearhead attack, and the other two will come in. But it's a lot less sophisticated than the American attack, the American attack, but it still basically allows, if you attack from one, you have the others activate, right? So you have 1, 2, 3, you get attack, the other two remain in defensive positions, and they will back you up if in a counterattack, and eventually they will conduct their own advances, which you see over here. And then you get to other areas which are more solo, small, localized actions. Those renewed offensive operations near Lyman and Seversk. This is yesterday. Still not marked, although there's fighting still in this area. The map hasn't advanced, and most likely won't advance for a week, but there's fighting north and in Chevish Yar, and around Chevish Yar, and south of Chevish Yar, though there is not much to report. There's nothing new. Still fighting. Though a lot of the Ukrainian markers are in the wrong place. Although they make it look like the Russians have advanced. There's fighting here. But it's actually clashes on the border. Right? Clashes with Ukrainian forces. Most of the Russian artillery is behind the Russian lines. Okay? They don't sit on the front line. The front line is what you would call the machine gun tripwire. Trenches with machine guns and mortars. And, of course, some anti-tank weapons as well. But most of the artillery sits further back and is mostly mobile. Russia has advanced a little bit here. Still fighting in other areas. The map... here we go. Far out. Come on. Scroll. Thank you. Alright, so there ain't... Russia is fighting in Novachin and surrounds. Now they've made small advances in the Povosk area. And though Ukraine has claimed that they've cleared Unachin village, a day ago, there is actually fighting in Unachin, reported today by Ukraine. It was 3 hours ago. So 4 hours ago, fighting here as well. And it's the only one. Ukraine's advances here, now wiped out. Ukraine's advances here 2 days ago, now wiped out. 24 to 48 hours, the Ukrainian advances, well, actually it looks like the Russians are back here. Back on this road. Back here. There's very few areas. So of the four out of 5 Ukrainian advances have now been wiped out after 48 hours, with heavy fighting along the western portion of what you would call, but this is center. So you have the western flanks, which are secure against secure this corner. Looks like they are going to buffer zone this to stop the Ukrainians bringing up artillery onto their road here. another key road Russia will have to secure would be they have to decide to and how they're going to push through Lyman, Solvak, and whether they're going to push through here or down through here. There's many talks that everybody wants this over by Christmas, and that meetings will take place to be announced soon. Zelensky is desperate. France and Germany in particular are desperate. France is asking for bailouts from the IMF, allegedly. So no more money from France, no more money from Britain. Britain is in a political crisis. Germany won't be able to continue much longer. Most of the smaller Baltic countries can't contribute more than $1 billion a year between them. Their finances are slim. Poland is tapping out and wants to get out. But a lot of them have said, right, that this is about, and I can understand from a political perspective that they don't want to take Putin at his word. But they're idiots. They're such short-sighted idiots. Coming into the summer, had they got a ceasefire, a 30-day ceasefire, right? They don't have to resupply Zelensky. In fact, they should have. But see, this is the problem. Every time, in the last couple of attempts at a ceasefire and agreements with Ukraine, Zelensky's brought in more troops and more ammunition. It's Zelensky who's time and time again proven that he can't be reliable. So from a Russian and Ukrainian perspective, Ukraine is always trying to get more because they know that the West is going to back him. But if Trump can't be played like a fiddle, hopefully he'll demonstrate some restraint and actually urge both sides to talk and get this stalled peace talks going. There might actually be peace, right? But we have a story coming out of Russia that Russian soldiers reached the center of Kupiansk, a position near key military industrial structures. They are, by the Ukrainians, are backing up this claim. Somewhat. They say north of the stadium. Freaking ads. There's this yellow here. They are north. They're actually this block area here. So come down this road and along this road. I think with the Ukrainians along this road and in these buildings, because they are expecting the Russians to come down back through this road, right? But this is the main road in, and the Russians have come down here before, but the Russians this time have come in through this, right? Russia, as Trump says, when the Ukrainians cut them off, the Russians come through the fields. They go around them. The Ukrainians have not been able to put up they've been able to put up a good defense, but as Trump says, eventually Russia will break through the fields. Now you're going to ask, why Russia didn't break through the fields before? It's because Russia has to spend days, sometimes weeks, clearing the fields of mines. Sometimes Ukraine has ceded mines multiple times over the same field. Russia's also fighting a limited war. There's other reasons. But, the Russians stopped short of surrounding Kupiansk. And when the Ukrainians allegedly counterattacked, because there's no record I can find until later, which indicates to me that the Ukrainians who came into mine after the Russians withdrew to Radvinkia, I think the Ukrainians made up a battle, and it's not the first time they've done it. When the Russians withdrew in late 2022, when the Russians withdrew as a sign of peace, the Ukrainians made up a lot of battles then, claiming they pushed back the Russians. And they did that in 24 as well, when they claimed to have pushed back. They made up a lot of tactical battles. Now, there are areas where the Russians are stalled, and that is a fact, that the majority of the battlefield doesn't move every day. But also, you've got to remember, they don't update the battlefield every day. And, I told you so, and I have told you so many times, that there is unrest in Ukraine. And the question now has been asked by RT, if you're listening, should have given me credit, but I think that's a bit egotistical of me to say so, because it's more likely they came to the conclusion themselves that the murderer of Andrei Parubi was in fact, as I suggested, according to rumours on Telegram, was not a Russian agent, but indeed a disgruntled father. Now, I thought it was a widow, actually, at first, because they were withholding the identity and gender of the killer. And again, as I said, the reason why they're holding on to the identity and not revealing too much information is because they're trying to find a Russian footprint so that they can, or they're trying to force the suspect to use their own words in a different story, that other than the story that's going around, that this is a grieving father who blames Andrei for starting this war. Okay? This war was almost over in 2022. Zelensky, we don't know what Zelensky would have done if Russia didn't invade and if the Azov battalion had not shelled Donetsk or seized Mariupol's steel mill or a few other things. But basically, if Zelensky had more control over Ukraine in the early days of his administration and did not urge Russia to invade, if he didn't mock Russia, if he didn't act like a dick when he came into office, right, and if he cracked down on far-right figures like Andrei Parubi, there might have actually been a election in the Donbass, and maybe Ukraine would have only lost 2 provinces. Well, 3 if you count Crimea, of course. But there's no guarantee that the election would have been won in Lugansk. Maybe. Donetsk could have been close. In fact, they might have only lost Lugansk. We don't know, because Zelensky, with his heavy-handedness and his bullying behaviour, you've seen how he acts, how he's always thrusting himself forward, how he's always making everything about him, how he's always asking for more. But the man accused is Mikhail Thrimov. Not a shadowy foreign agent. He is a Ukrainian son who went missing in the war against Russia and has found out since that the Ukrainian authorities withheld his name from and benefits that he marked his. Now, this crime has not been brushed aside as one man's actions. The painful reality is many Ukrainians want favourable negotiations with Russians. Only 11%, yesterday it was 22%, but that was a different rating agency. And like I said, Zelensky is at 35%, and a lot of Ukrainian commentators have said more like 5%. But most Ukrainians are exhausted and see their leaders as not protectors, but as predators and obstacles to peace. Now, this isn't new. Every Ukrainian president, even some of their more favourable ones in the early days, have never, right, enjoyed popular support after their election. Most of them are nowhere to be found. They don't want anything to do with Ukraine. Ukraine wants nothing to do with them. Ukraine has become increasingly paranoid, delusional, nationalist, and that's not a bad thing, except when you're ultra-nationalist and you want to rewrite your own history to make out that you're some sort of super state and super special state, and that you're the keystone to civilization, and you're going to be Captain Sky Shield of Europe and an important trade hub. There's only one problem. Eastern Europe ain't that rich, and you can't be an important trade hub if you're an unstable war zone. Or that the only thing you've ever offered to Europe is, for the last 75 years, is prostitutes. And that the prostitution that went on under the USSR was merely a systemic problem that was already in Ukraine for the last century before that. Ukraine is not in a good position because the Ukrainian people refuse to reflect on their own actions first. You cannot wag your finger at your neighbours unless you're willing to be judged. Judge not lest you be judged. And oh boy, does Ukraine need to be judged. Now, I ain't a prissy virgin. I am no white knight. I am no bastion of virtue. However, I consider myself a moderate who has no stake in this war and really has a beef with both sides. But you cannot lie about Russia's advances. But Vladimir Putin has said that his troops are moving forward to create a buffer zone. That it's complex and that this is in order to show the problems. Yeah. See, the military problem and diplomatic problem are entwined. Alright? So Putin has to maintain pressure on Ukraine, otherwise Europe and that will just sit back and say, well, if Russia shows any sign of weakness, we won't stop the war. Like the European Courts of Human Rights, of course, and Netherlands complaints. Russia considers themselves null and void, basically, because the threats to bomb Moscow and Beijing were not helpful. Saying there's no disagreements between Washington and Moscow, the desires for political and diplomatic resolution. But yes, Russia's push is a buffer zone. So these are talking points basically from Peskov, from Putin's speech writer, whatever you want to call him, advisor, spokesperson, basically expecting them to continue. Yes, so the current negotiations, which are ongoing, are expected to start preparing for a meeting between Putin and Zelensky. Because the situation, of course, once Russia breaks through another, and this is where I wonder, where's the breakthrough? I think they've already had a breakthrough in Lyman, but I mean, that's small. Another breakthrough, they've had a breakthrough in Kupiansk, that's small. Another pressure point would be a breakthrough in Silvesk, or what might actually tip the Ukrainians if Russia breaks Pavlovsk and starts sieging from this side. If they break through Pavlovsk, only have this small narrow gap for evacuations, I think that would be a major setback. But Putin would have to do so without major losses, because we don't know how many battlefield losses Russia has. But according to many reports now, in the last battle, in the last week of battles, over 1,000 dead Ukrainian, 3,000 wounded, and only 9 dead Russians. Only 9. I don't think it was that low. But I don't think it was much higher than that either. I think that might have been 9 from the last day. But still, 70-30 is the estimate. 70% of deaths and casualties on the Ukrainian side. So if you're wounded, you have a 70% chance of dying, whereas in Russia, if you're wounded, you have only a 30% chance of dying. And a 30% chance of being sent home. So, whereas Ukraine, there's no going home. The wounded are sent back to the front unless you're severely disabled, and even then, they try to keep you on into some sort of role so that they can send whoever job you took to the front line. So somewhere in Ukraine there are people praying you die so that they can keep their... But if you die, it's who's next. But that's the problem, isn't it? Until the West has some compassion. See, that's the thing. They don't actually have any emotional connection to Ukraine. So they don't really care about Ukraine. They just pretend to care so they can get attention and feed their dopamine habit of trying to pretend to be good people. Good people don't pretend. Good people don't need to brag about their achievements. Good is between you and God. Good is how you treat your neighbours. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. Please like, share and subscribe because the YouTube gods demand it. Otherwise, your views allegedly don't count. Now, I don't know how true this is, but unless I get more subscribers, I can't measure myself for the metrics. I need to get way more subscribers before I even have reliable metrics. But on other platforms, pretty much, thank you for your, thank you. I still need more subscribers on it as I can, trying to, particularly on Rumble. But see, I have a Patreon for an RPG and I have a Patreon for my writing, and I'm sticking to that for now. I know people ask for Subscribe Star. They won't give me one. I need way more subscribers before they'll give me a Subscribe Star. So please, you can support me by joining my current patrons, buying my books, or buying my merch. All my links are in the link tree, which you can obtain in the description below on Rumble and YouTube. Scan the QR code on the screen, or look in my profile. Thank you. I really appreciate your time, and see you in the next video. Bye for now.